Ellen, how are you?
Welcome, everyone. It is now 5 o'clock and time to begin. My name is Donald Taylor, and I'm responsible for membership and chapter liaisons at TASH. Welcome to today's training, Developing Strategy, Powerful Tools for Making Change, presented by Tauna, Szymanski, and Barb Trader. This is the third of our four-part webinar series, Chapter Skills Development, Making Change Happen in Your State. A number of important federal laws and regulations to improve the lives of people with disabilities have recently come into effect, but require quality implementation at the state and local level for their impact to be realized. This series is designed to help develop among chapters and members the full range of skills necessary for making these state and local policy changes. The format of today's series is that our presenters will speak for about 50 minutes, then there will be 10 minutes at the end dedicated to participant questions and answers. But just because there is dedicated time at the end doesn't mean you have to hold your questions until then. Our presenters will address questions as they come in, so don't hesitate to pose a question as you think of it. There are two ways you can ask your question. Number one, participant microphones are enabled, so if you have a microphone on your computer, you can pose your question via the webinar audio. The microphone defaults to muted, so activate your microphone to pose the question by clicking on the microphone icon at the top center menu bar. Clicking once will activate the microphone. When your microphone is active, the icon will be green. We request that you keep your microphone muted when not actively participating so as to minimize audio interruptions. The second way you can ask a question or make other comment is if you do not have audio on your computer, you can use the chat box in the lower right corner to type your question, and our presenters will read them out loud for the rest of the participants. Also notice the green speaker icon at the top center to the left of the microphone icon. You can use this drop-down volume control to adjust your individual volume. Today we are excited to have Tauna Szymanski and Barb Trader to explain the status and implementation of key laws and why the present moment is so important for members to be taking action. Tauna Szymanski is the coordinator of the Arlington Inclusion Task Force in Arlington, Virginia, an ad hoc group of parents, teachers, and community members who are interested in changing the paradigm regarding how children with significant disabilities are educated in the Arlington public school system. Formed in June 2014, the task force is loosely affiliated with the Arlington Special Education Parent-Teacher Association and the Arlington Special Education Advisory Committee. Tauna is the parent of a 6-year-old daughter with significant support needs. When not parenting and working on the Inclusion Task Force, she has a full-time job as a climate change attorney. Barb Trader is the executive director here at TASH. In her role at TASH, Barb leads APPRAISE, the Alliance for Prevention of Restraint, Aversive Intervention, and Seclusion, a 23-member alliance of national nonprofits with a mission to eliminate aversive interventions. She also serves as co-chair of the Education Work Group and for the Collaboration to Promote Self-Determination, a 15-member coalition to advance high-impact public policy. Please join me in welcoming Tauna Szymanski and Barb Trader.
Thank you, Donald. I just want to share that Tauna and I were at an Inclusion Task Force meeting on Tuesday night together, and I was so impressed with that group. There were over 50 parents from the Arlington County area interested in inclusive education, and they're getting more and more organized, and they're strategizing on how to bring about change. So when Tauna is able to get her microphone fixed, we'll hear a little bit more about that effort. But also, I just want to acknowledge how thrilling it is to be in the company of parents and other advocates who are really serious about bringing about change, and real change for kids going to school right now. So Tauna, take your time, do your problem solving, and we'll work you into today's webinar as soon as your microphone's available. So give Donald the high sign. So today we're This is the third of a four-part series, and as we keep saying, there's no real recipe to follow for change. The real secret to making things change in your communities is to acknowledge that there's a difference between what reality is and what you want, and that you get started on a change agenda. Once you start and once you figure out where you want to go, then the next steps will come to you as you make progress. So today's agenda is first, understanding the difference between the levels of change. We've covered this a little bit, but we're going to go a little bit more into that today. 2, know how to construct a set of principles and non-negotiables so you are a bit more strategic in how you pursue your change agenda. 3, learn how to identify the state and local levers for change. And 4, learn the key strategies and activities for action. And we may want to do a little interaction on that last point. So I hope some of you have microphones available. If not, get your fingers ready for typing. So the quote of the day is the key to change is to let go of fear. You have to be fearless if you're going to be an advocate, but it's really worth it if you think about the difference in quality of life for the people that we care about. So let's all promise to let go of fear today. We've talked a little bit about TASH's vision. I think everybody on this phone call really understands what TASH's vision is. And we know that the vision that we have is pretty different from the reality that we have throughout the United States. We have this vision of a world in which people with disabilities are fully participating members of all of our communities, and that no one is segregated and everyone belongs. Wouldn't it be great if people didn't have to earn their way in to every community that they engage in throughout their lifetime? And we've covered this as well. In order to make change in your communities, you don't have to be a lawyer or even a detailed student of federal public policy. Once you pick the area that you want to change, you should know what the public policy generated around that area says. For the most part, we have a terrific federal floor of protections. There's been a lot of work on disability civil rights in the 40 years of TASH's history. But we know that we are not seeing the promise of these laws implemented to the degree that they should be in most states and communities. And that's why local advocacy is so important. So just recently, we went over these in detail during the first webinar, so I'm not going to explain all of these to you again. But we've had some real recent successes as well, especially the HCBS waiver rule reform, which was just introduced in 2014. This waiver reform says that settings that isolate will no longer be funded by waiver funds. And yet states are submitting transition plans as if all the settings in their state comply. So some of you have already been pretty active on this. If you're on a chapter board or a chapter leader, you may have gotten an email from me earlier today that this waiver rule is being challenged right now in the House of Representatives at the federal level. So advocacy never stops. Even when we get something through that we really want, advocates at the local level need to be vigilant to make sure that it's implemented, but that it also stays in place. So here, this is a slide you've seen before, but I'm going to repeat it today because the levers for where you can make change are in these state responsibilities. So the federal government passes legislation. It leaves a lot to the states on how it's going to implement that legislation. So here are the chief responsibilities where you as advocates can have influence. First, it's the state's job to interpret and determine how they're going to administrate federal programs. Most federal laws also allow for the flow of federal money into the states. So if you think about IDEA money or voc rehab money or Medicaid money, which funds long-term services and supports for people with disabilities, all those pots of money come with expectations for the feds, from the feds, on how they're going to be used. But it's up to the states to set priorities, to interpret what the federal law means. A lot of state law is completely out of compliance with federal law, and advocates need to be willing to look at that, point it out, and get it changed. States also make plans and set priorities. Right now, state plans for becoming more in compliance and getting better results for students under IDEA. Those state plans are being evaluated right now by the Office of Special Education Programs. But you as stakeholders can have a lot of say in what states decide to do in that planning process, which then becomes an implementation process. States are also always expected to involve stakeholders. Some states do a good job of this, some states barely do this. Or if they do it, it's not clear to the stakeholders in the state what they're doing. So as stakeholders, you can definitely ask and really insist on greater stakeholder engagement. States also determine enforcement mechanisms. And if those enforcement mechanisms are in place, you can use those mechanisms to make complaints, to ask for something different. And if those enforcement mechanisms are not in place or not readily available for you to understand what they are, then you can also act on that. States are usually responsible for collecting data and to use that data to make decisions. Advocates can have a lot to say. That data. Okay, now I'm back. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So stakeholders can have a lot to say about what data states decide to collect. They can look at the data that states do collect and decide whether or not it's valid. Just recently, we had a lot of advocates in Connecticut challenge the restraint and seclusion data that the state reported to the Office of Civil Rights. They were pretty sure it was very short of what was really occurring, and they were right. And that was something that was covered in the news. So that's another area that you can be very active in. And another is making sure that states are mandating that evidence-based practices or promising practices are used in school districts and in other areas of service delivery. Now, Tauna and I are both aware of a case where the notion of evidence-based practice was used in a way that it's not intended to be used. So we won't go into that unless somebody's curious. But we've seen a lot of service delivery aimed at people with disabilities when we know that the outcomes are not going to be good because they're not valid practices. So those are things that we can also weigh in on. So those are some levers for where you you can make change, and good guidance for how you decide to go after change. It's kind of a checklist, if you will. And then, so everybody can still hear me, right? Okay. So then we need to figure out at what level are you going to take your advocacy. Most of us are really concerned about individuals because we know people with disabilities who aren't going to get what they need. So individual advocacy is one person at a time. If you are an organized group of people, particularly if you are a TASH chapter, I would challenge you to understand that individual advocacy only changes things for that one person. And that's important, but it's not going to bring about change for anybody else. So if you're already advocating on behalf of one person, think about how you can build on that and advocate on behalf of a change in a system or a change in policy or how the state agency acts in your state. So there's 3 levels of change. There's individual advocacy, there's systems advocacy, and by that I mean your school district or the way that money comes out of your VR system or the vendors that the VR system engages with, or some sort of a systems question. And then public advocacy takes your call for change to the whole state and, when appropriate, to the whole nation. So Tauna, are you available? Oh, Victoria has a question. A VR system is the vocational rehabilitation system in your state, which is usually organized under the State Department of Labor or the State Department of Commerce, and that's where, or sometimes the State Health and Human Services Agency, that's the agency that puts people with disabilities to work, or it's supposed to do that. Sure thing. So, Tauna, are you able to speak yet? Donald? What's our status with Tauna? Okay, we'll continue. I'm going to see if we've got Tauna on by the
Barb
end
says,
of
or Tauna says go ahead and she can return to her slides in a minute.
Reflect on her own slides, but if that's not workable, I'll just tell her story for her. So there she is. Tauna, are you able to? Okay. Well, I'm ready to go back in slides when Tauna's ready. Okay, Donald? Okay. Okay, great, thanks. So I love this quote. I'm going to use it again, and this should hopefully motivate a lot of people. Our problems stem from our acceptance of this filthy, rotten system. Spoken by Dorothy Day, one of our great change agents from early in the 20th century. You know, we don't have to put up with bad things. So that's really the heart of advocacy. And this quote drives me a lot. Again, we talked about this. These are just reminders. These are where you get the data on what's going on in your state, so you know if things are going south for more people than just the 1 or 2 people that you might be talking to. There's a lot of other data sources. These are just some examples of where you might find data. And once you decide you're going to take a stand, just remember that it's pretty simple stuff. if you're good at project management in other areas of your life, making change happen requires about the same kinds of basic steps. First, believe that you can make a change. Second, define what your goals are. Third, make a plan. Fourth, begin implementing that plan by taking action. And then 5, this is just a reminder that you're going to have to make some sacrifices in order to stick with it. And usually that sacrifice is a lot of personal time. And 6, never give up. Never give up. So those are the 6 rules of success in bringing about change. So let's talk about determining what it is that you want. We talked last week about first understanding what your values are and then determining the gaps that are in your state related to those values. So first, you might want inclusive education in your state. You might find out that statewide, only 2 or 3% of students with severe disabilities are included at all. So you know that you want to work in inclusive education. So the first thing to decide is what are your non-negotiables? Well, this isn't the first thing to decide, but you have to decide what it is you want and what it is you're willing to compromise on. You come up with a set of principles to help you make that decision. We're going to talk about principles in a minute. So the point here is that you have to know what you want, you have to know what your principles are, you have to be clear before you start taking a stand, what you're willing to negotiate on and what you're not. And at the very beginning, you ask for all you want, not for what you think you're going to get, because then you're starting from a compromised position already. So start with all you want, and then make sure that there are points you can compromise on. This also speaks a bit to the fact that change happens incrementally. So when I talk about non-negotiables, I'm talking about things related to key principles. So for example, one of your key principles might be that if a change is going to happen, it has to benefit all students. So you may not be willing to accept a change that only impacts students with learning disabilities, for example, or students that are have some other label. You may want to stick to a principle that any change that happens has to benefit all students, or at least that it can't hurt any students. So those are, by principles, that's what I mean. Now you can experience incremental change, but the incremental change, like for example, you may see all students being included in one school rather than the whole district. That's incremental change, especially if the district is planning on expanding that change for the whole district. But you have to be very careful about what you're willing to negotiate on and what you're not. That's the point of this. So, the main issue here is to have clarity on your position. First, by having your principles in place and then determining your non-negotiables. A really good tool for determining what your key principles might be is at this website. It's the framework for disability policy, and it was developed by Bobby Silverstein, who is one of the chief authors of the ADA. But it's a very long document, but it really does list a set of principles and how to evaluate policy based on what the federal framework really is for disability rights, and so on. So the definition of a principle is fundamental, primary, or general truth from which others are derived. And again, you can find examples of principles in this document, but I have some example principles here too. By the way, I'm showing education examples, but their principles are equally important for anything else you're advocating for, such as expanded employment services, such as better services for adults with developmental disabilities, and so on. So with the SWIFT Center, we created a set of policy principles so we could use them when we were evaluating state and district policies, and as we are providing TA to district and state leaders on how to look at policy. So this is just a set of principles we feel are really important. First, that every student's individual strengths, preferences, and abilities are highly valued, that every student receives rigorous and quality education, that every adult in the school takes ownership for all the children in the building, that schools actively engage family and community partners, that students are given meaningful opportunities to engage in their education, and that students are healthy physically, socially, and emotionally. So you can think about a lot of different policy questions, and you can compare it against these principles and see if you've gone outside of these principles or not based on what you're seeing. Here are principles for ESEA reauthorization. Many of you have seen this list because we've been circulating requests for sign-on to letters and so on. So this set of ESA principles should not be news to a lot of you. The exciting thing about this set of principles is that it was signed on by so many organizations. So what's good for kids with disabilities, as it turns out, is good for kids of color too, and kids that are marginalized because of a variety of things. So this is
all right. So Tauna, it's
Tauna,
okay. So
do you
I
have
didn't
volume?
hear anything you said before, but I will just
I
guess
can't.
introduce
Oops.
the
What's
Inclusion
that?
Task Force in Arlington, Virginia, where I live.
I can hear
how it
you.
started,
Can everybody else hear
what we're
Tauna?
focused on. And Barb, please interrupt me if you covered any of this or if I
Okay,
should
so
emphasize anything.
too soft. Tauna, can you turn it up?
So basically, we started the task force about 9 months
Okay,
ago.
let's go back to your slides then.
And the sort of inspiration from my perspective
Okay,
personally was I have a 6-year-old daughter who has autism. She's on the autism spectrum. She is completely non-speaking.
So Tauna, it's up.
And she had gone to what is basically the only real formal inclusion program within our school district, which is at the preschool level. And when she was there, she was still formally most of the day in a self-contained classroom, but the school made a real effort to include her in a typical preschool setting for a good portion of the day. So when we started doing the IEP for kindergarten, we said, well, let's just retain, the hours that she has in her current IEP, and, we'll be happy for that. Ultimately, we'd like to push for full inclusion, but as we make this transition, let's just stick with what we have. And they said, oh no, we don't do inclusion here at this school. And so I'm a lawyer, and the lawyer in me immediately was like, excuse me. So we had a number of meetings. Ultimately, they finally agreed to retain what she had. At about the same time, there was a budget threat to this preschool program going on. This was last spring. And all the folks in the school district that had experiences there sort of decided to sort of speak up in support of the program. So we have a very active special education parent-teacher association in Arlington. It's about 4 years old. It's the first one in the state of Virginia. And the listserv, I think, has about 600 people on it. It's incredibly active discussion listserv. And so, folks were sort of talking about this issue with this preschool. Anyway, long story short, at the end of the day, folks said, well, why don't we do something about the fact that this is the only inclusion program in Arlington? Why is it that after age 5 or 6, there aren't any other inclusion opportunities? So we had a meeting in June and sort of went from there. So we sort of spent, I'll talk about the process in a minute, but I think from the beginning we decided this effort would only be effective if we sort of started from the top down. We did a little bit of reading on other school districts that had made this conversion, sort of paradigm shift in how they educate students with special needs, and all the sort of lessons learned were the school board really has to adopt this as its vision, and there has to be a lot of buy-in from the leadership, not the special ed leadership, but the general ed leadership. And this is something that really has to be owned by them. So in thinking about our strategy, we thought let's really start from them. At the same time, it can't hurt to do sort of a parallel effort from the bottom up. So, working one by one, family by family, and sort of pushing for more inclusion in IEP. So that's not really part of what we do, but obviously a lot of folks who are involved in the Inclusion Task Force are really interested in ensuring that their children are included for more or all of the day in a general education setting. So that is happening in parallel, and doing a lot of education, dissemination of information through through our email list to the SEPTA listserv. And then we've started a Facebook page, which has just a bunch of information that we haven't created, but that others have that we sort of bring attention to. So that's sort of our sort of dual pronged effort. Can I switch the slides or? Oh, okay, great. So we sort of spent the first 6 months or so, I guess from June to about December, sort of thinking about what our common vision was going to be. I was concerned that we were going to have a lot of pushback from the special ed community. I spoke from experience. Before I knew about the research on inclusion, I actually 3 years prior had pushed really hard to get my daughter included in this most restricted setting possible. We have an autism specific program in Arlington, and they wanted to put her in a non-categorical special ed setting, and I said, oh no, it has to be even more restrictive than that. It has to be this 6-kid, 3-teacher classroom. And so it took me 3 years, but I had come full circle on this. So I knew from personal experience that there were going to be folks who thought that really small classrooms were absolutely the best thing for their kids. And so being respectful of that, I think we sort of developed a fairly nuanced perspective and message, which was, if a family requests inclusion, they should get it. That should sort of be the default, obviously. So when you're looking at a kid, the assumption should always be, let's educate those children in the general ed setting. If the family, for whatever reason, requests a more restrictive setting, fine. That's, they can discuss that. So that was sort of the nuanced view. We decided we couldn't be super hardcore about it just because we didn't want to have, infighting right off the bat to derail ourselves before we even got going. So we started our meetings in December. Our first meeting was with the director of special ed, just sort of to let her know that we were going to be doing this. And then immediately we started meeting with the school board members, with the superintendent, and with all the assistant superintendents. So what have we learned so far? We're really fortunate in Arlington to be located right next to Washington. We have an incredibly talented group of individuals in Arlington and on the task force. So we have a number of lawyers. We have several PhDs. We have national disability advocates. We have professors, teachers. So it's a really amazing group of people on this task force. We're incredibly blessed. And everyone's really dedicated. So there's a variety of parents who are stay-at-home parents and then working parents, but everyone seems to sort of pitch in when they can. Pretty much all the individuals who are most committed have children with really significant special needs. So those are the people who are most fired up. We found that in Arlington, they do an okay job of including the folks with less significant needs. It's really the kids who, like my daughter, who have really significant support needs that the county really just kind of puts their foot down and refuses inclusion for them. So that's where the effort was really needed. I feel like the success of the task force so far really is almost 100% due to the fact that we have a really active existing network of special ed parents in the district. So the SEPTA that I mentioned is very active. We very quickly developed a core group through that. So to the extent that exists in your district, take advantage of it. I think when SEPTA first started, it was really hard for them to sort of spread the word on it. It's sort of because the district has confidentiality policies where they can't sort of pass out names of folks who have IEPs. So I wasn't involved in the starting of the SEPTA. I'm not exactly sure how they went about doing that. But the other sort of lesson learned is really being responsive. So after every meeting, we sort of type a summary up. Thank you, following up after every meeting, and really sort of being on the ball about keeping things moving. We have incredible momentum so far this year. We've really only been doing this for about 4 or 5 months, but starting to see some success. But at the same time, we're really keeping this in perspective. We know that sort of big systems change takes a long time. So we're keeping in mind that this is sort of a 7 to 10 year effort. So I would really like to see, by the time my daughter's sort of exiting high school, that you know, the next generation won't have to fight for that. That this will be sort of automatic at that point. So we really know that we're in for the long haul. And then the other thing is really taking a very cooperative perspective with the school district. So, you know, there are a lot of lawyers involved in this group, and a litigation strategy has been mentioned more than once, but I think I personally am not a litigator. I really feel like we could make a lot more progress, probably faster, if we got cooperative buy-in from everyone on this. So that's at least our current strategy, is really to sort of spread the research on inclusion and try to get everyone to sort of get on board, and then have them take ownership, have the district take ownership of this issue and really push it after that. So that's sort of, so far it seems to be successful. We'll see. I mean, nothing's really happened yet, so we'll see. We're really just getting going, but that's sort of what we've learned so far. So.
I actually think the school is kind of afraid of this group of parents.
We'll see.
They're smart, they're committed so far. So. I actually think that the school district is kind of afraid of this group of parents. They're smart, they're committed, and they've been very strategic so far. So let me, let's see. Okay. So we talked about developing a set of principles and how important that might be. Now we're going to talk about messaging just a bit. These things are so specific to the issue that you choose to take on, but some of the things to think about with messaging is that you need to understand the self-interest of who you're talking to. We talked about self-interest last week, so you can review those slides to remind yourself what we mean by that. But in Tauna's example, for instance, Arlington Public Schools prides itself in being a really top quality school district, and they care a lot about their reputation. So developing messaging around reputation and top quality is a good strategy for this group of parents. Another thing that often resonates with people don't know what inclusion means. Inclusion is kind of a hard concept to describe, and we see all kinds of iterations of inclusion that we would never mean. But a lot of people understand what equity means. And so rather than inclusion, some people are starting to use equity. The Swift Center, for example, uses education equity when they're messaging, and it seems to resonate pretty well. That's not to say that you can't use the word inclusion. I'm just giving you some examples. Another message that we found is really working with Congress as an example, and it works on both sides of the aisle. It actually works better on the Republican side than the Democratic side, is that we want to give people with significant disabilities a chance to be productive and responsible citizens. And if we continue to raise generations of kids with very little education and send them right into sheltered workshops, we're not giving them that chance. We're railroading them into a life of poverty. So the point here is just be strategic about your message, and particularly remind yourself each time you message what you're asking for to the audience. So this is just another example of messaging. I often use this slide because it's such a great example of what we mean by equity. Equality means you treat everybody the same. Equity means you give some people a hand up because they started from a different place. So just another trick about equity. Maybe a picture says it better than words. And here's a demonstration of the message we talked about just a minute ago. If you provide children with a safe and an inclusive education where they really have education equity and access to rigorous educational materials, and you combine that with a chance for real jobs at real wages, what you get out of that is independent community living and economic advancement. And so the American dream will be available to people. So the picture is saying our message for us. And this is a quote that I think we're going to start using. The opposite of poverty is not wealth. In too many places, the opposite of poverty is justice. So we're seeking social justice for the people that we care about. So as you decide what your strategy might be, once you decide what you want to do, then these are just the things to remember to round out your strategy is who are you going to work with? And as Tauna explained, she's working with 2 of these groups right now, and the media may soon become part of it. But they're keeping their grassroots engaged through lots of communication, through meetings, through Facebook, through the use of a listserv. They're updated all the time. So the grassroots is engaged and informed. They're also meeting with decision makers. And so 2 prongs of the advocacy stool, or 2 legs of the advocacy stool are being used. The media is a great advocacy stool or advocacy leg to use when the time's right, and when you're strategic about it. One thing I liked about what Tauna said is that they're working right now to be cooperative with the school district. They don't want to close any doors. They also don't want to publicly humiliate people, at least not at this stage. But sometimes that's important, especially when you've made clear demands and you've been patient and you've been working with a group and you're still not getting anywhere. I was once involved in an advocacy effort where we were trying to get the organizers of the Peachtree Road Race to accept wheelchair athletes. This is a long time before wheelchair road racing became something that anybody knew about. It was the first major road race that advocates worked on. And so after 2 years of negotiating, we got sick of it. We knew we were being strung along. We sued them in federal court, and we invited all the media. So we came out with all barrels. And guess what? There's the largest wheelchair division of any road race in the world is now the Peachtree Road Race. So you use your tools when the time is right. I believe we've already covered this. I'm not sure we need to cover this again. Let's see. Yep. We've already discussed this. One thing that we did not discuss, and this is relevant in some cases and in some states, is that some of our states and school districts have been sued already, and they're under a court order or they're under a settlement agreement. And for example, the state of Virginia is under an active settlement agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice to deinstitutionalize people. And that's a great lever to use for advocates who want better funding or want funding to be constructed differently to support adults in the state of Virginia. So when Tauna's done making inclusive education possible, her daughter will be about the age where adult supports is going to be a question, and she can turn her attention to making sure that that happens in Virginia, because right now adult services in Virginia are really segregated. So strategies for change, this is where you really get to use your imagination. I'm always amazed at what advocates decide to do. There are 3 basic strategies. One is education, and there's a lot of ways you can do that. Another is legislation, and a third is litigation. And litigation burns bridges. We just have to remember that. So if you want, I think too many parents have found this out when they've pursued due process for their children. Not that they shouldn't have done that, but everything for that child then becomes difficult within the school district. The parents develop a reputation, and nothing else changes for any other kids because the school district has become embittered. Now, that's not always what happens, but that's something that you're going to have to take into account. But I will say that one incredibly effective way to use litigation is to further define the law. When we pass laws, either at the federal level or at the state level, people are, it's up to interpretation and how they're implemented. And so litigation has been a great way to define the ADA further, to define Title II of the ADA in particular. Litigation has helped define IDEA. So it's a terrific tool. It's not one that we should shy away from, but we need to be judicious about how we use it for when the time's right. So in terms of education, there's just so many things you can do when you educate, and it's a very gentle way to bring about change. It's a very cooperative way, a really useful way, and often it can be the most effective way to bring about change. You really have to think about the audience you're talking to and what's of interest to them, what's their self-interest, and you speak directly to that. We try so hard to win on our moral outrage, and that usually doesn't sell the day. Education is about really being savvy about doing your homework and learning who you're talking to and speaking directly to them in a way that's respectful of where they're coming from. In terms of decision-making education, I've seen advocates do so many cool things with elected officials, like Board of Education members or congressional members, or even appointed people to state agency positions, and so on. You can do briefings. You can ask for a briefing so that you are doing some organized presentation. One advocate in Kentucky took a group of state officials on a study tour so they could go tour people who live in their own homes with supports and services. They could tour them and see what their day looked like and what their home looked like and how that differed from what a group home or an institution might look like. And you lead those tours in a very orchestrated way so you can help people understand what they're seeing. A study tour to an inclusive school would be a great way to interact with your own school board, but also get state education agency officials or state legislators aware of what you mean by inclusive schools. Visits to your own agency or your own activity, something that's going really well, that you're really proud of, that you want to make sure gets replicated throughout the state. Those visits are also very good. So, and those are just some things. There's a lot of other things you can do to educate people. In terms of TASH, we've done a lot of professional development to influence the field and to influence the way parents view their own children with disabilities. We put on conferences, everybody knows that. We're starting to do more regional conferences so we can bring new information to people in the field. We've done briefings on Capitol Hill. We've done briefings for our partner organizations, and we've led some forums. So there's a lot of that kind of thing. I know CalTASH a couple of years ago did community forums in 6 communities on youth transition, which were, I think, really effective. Grassroots education, there's a lot of different things you can do there. I notice we're running out of time, so I better speed up. And then public education, I think the media is the best way to use public education. Or to do public education. There's a lot you can do there. I've seen some interesting Twitter campaigns where people are just asking questions that lead people to do things like, what's the restraint and seclusion policy in your public school? And so on and so forth. So there's a lot you could do just through education. In terms of legislation, we need to think about this a bit broadly. Because what we're really looking at is things that are enforceable. State legislation is one thing. State regulation is also enforceable. State guidance documents are enforceable. So those things are things that you may want to look at and determine whether or not you want to impact them. A couple weeks ago, I told the story of how a group of master's level students at VCU were the reasons why we now have a new restraint and seclusion law in the state of Virginia. And that's way exciting that college students were able to bring about that change. So don't ever underestimate your power to do things, because it's pretty exciting once you start asking for change. And we talked about litigation. So some examples of litigation are the settlement agreements or the class action lawsuits that have taken place just recently in Rhode Island and Oregon related to sheltered workshops, and in Virginia, Illinois, and Georgia related to institutions. So that's what we wanted to cover today. This is sort of the end of the content on what is advocacy, the different ways to do advocacy, some tips on getting started. I do want to leave you with this quote of the day: be opportunistic, because you might have a strategy in place and then something falls in your lap, some great news story. This is just one example of something that might fall in your lap, but this news story really triggered a lot of action on Capitol Hill related to the use of restraint and seclusion. It actually caused the senator from the state of Connecticut to become a co-sponsor on a federal bill. And advocates helped him see the opportunity there. So you might have to change course depending on what's happening in the world in a way that can be very powerful. So we're done for today. Next week, we're going to cover some tips, some tricks of the trade that advocates have learned, give you just a review of some steps to figure out what you plan to do as advocates. So Tauna and I are now available for questions and answers, and since we're a little late, I'll hang on a little later. Thanks, everybody. Any questions? Tauna, I found that we leave them speechless with wonder. Oh, we've got some typing. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Karen. Great. All right, well, I think we're done for today. I don't see any questions, so I want to make sure to thank Tauna for being a part of this today and for being so patient with the technology glitches. We really appreciate you hanging in there. And I hope everybody signs back in next Thursday at 5 o'clock for the closing session. But I do also want to remind people that on June 17th, we'll be doing our Capitol Hill Day to visit. Oh, we'll get to your question in a minute. We'll do Capitol Hill Day on June 17th. We invite all advocates to participate by participating first in the preparation webinars for Capitol Hill Day, so you know what we're going to be asking for, and you know how to do your homework, so you're prepared and ready. And you can do Capitol Hill Day here.
School PTAs, and school PTAs should represent the needs and interests of all students in the school, including kids with IEPs. But ESEPTA is a district-wide force, and what we've used it for in Arlington is really sort of both an advocacy tool and an educational tool. So there are monthly meetings, typically with external speakers. But personally, I think the value really is this listserv, this common listserv, which anyone can join. Teachers are on it, parents are on it. It's typically mostly parents, but people will post questions like, what schools do a great job with inclusion? Who are the best people, to do this? Who are the best occupational therapists in the area? Who are the best, and we have moms lists that are also geared towards special needs, but this is sort of a district-wide thing focused on education. It's open to general ed parents too. So I mean, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing, and I think everything that people have achieved in Arlington, it's largely due to the fact that the SEPTA exists. So it's a very, very good organizing tool. Thank you.